All right, welcome to our lecture on political philosophy, a very short introduction, chapter 2, on political authority. So we're going to be talking about right now what political authority is, why we need it, and what it does for us, as well as how it ought to be structured. So, generally speaking, authority has two elements. You can think of it as sort of like the same sort of authority that an expert has, so they present this possibility in the text, right? The wise man on the mountain, right? Some sort of guiding authority, as well as force or enforcement. If you're missing either of these elements, you end up with something skewed. Pure guidance ends up providing not enough to keep a government or social structure together, right? It's saying, well, wouldn't it be nice? On the other hand, pure force or enforcement is just tyranny. So when we're looking for authority, we're looking for something that both compels obedience and punishes disobedience. And there's going to be a tricky matter of balancing those two elements. We won't have time to talk about that in depth today, but it is something to keep in mind, is how much force and how much guidance should a political system use to seek its values? And is it possible to actually distinguish those two elements cleanly? So one of the first people we're going to look at when we talk about political authority is Thomas Hobbes. And Thomas Hobbes wrote a book called The Leviathan. And he was a very, we'll say, grim person when it came to his understanding of human nature. His belief that life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short, to paraphrase. The idea being that without a government, without a social structure, we are constantly at war with one another and the environment. We can't really cooperate, and life sucks. Now, this isn't merely saying that we need authority to force us to work together, because sometimes people get along in family units, and they get along out of trust and benevolence and that sort of thing. What Hobbes is saying, though, is that you need authority to really be able to trust one another. Trust is required for cooperation, and cooperation is required for life. Right? So it is clear that we need to cooperate to live. Right? No man is an island, as they say. If we were to live totally absent anyone else, any other help, we'd probably die pretty quickly, most of us anyway. There are few, if any, human beings in the world who could survive totally on their own. And definitely, cooperation is required for a good life. Now, even if you could scrape by yourself, if you want to enjoy the comforts of a home, right, if you want to have television and food and all of these things, you're going to need people to help you grow that food and make that television and all of those things. And it's simply impossible for a single human being to have the expertise required to do all of these things alone. Even homesteaders, right, people who live off the grid, engage in economic transactions, right? They deal with others. And many of the skills they acquired through dealing with others, through education, all of which requires some sort of cooperation. The idea that trust is required for cooperation is pretty straightforward. If I don't know if you're going to screw me over, I might not be willing to deal with you. There's actually some interesting economic evidence for this piece in particular, but also for the larger sort of belief as a whole, which is that one of the ways you can tell whether or not a government is really going to be successful in growing its economy is whether or not they are successful at enforcing contract law. Think about it this way. You have a car that has some sort of damage, so you need to leave it at a shop to be taken care of, right, for them to fix it. So you go to the mechanic, you say, okay, I'll come back next Tuesday, I'll pay you X dollars. So that's a contract. Now imagine you lived in a country where contracts couldn't be trusted. You wouldn't be sure that next Tuesday that car would still be there, and they wouldn't be sure that you'd actually give them the money you promised. You can see how this would break down very quickly. I come back to pick up my car, and lo and behold, it's gone. The car's been sold. Obviously going to be a problem. Think also about larger political structures. Think also about larger projects. Larger political structures. Think also about larger projects. So something like building a house. I am counting on you as my contractor, right, or as my architect, to be engaged in a multiple month-long project. If at any point during that project I'm just to leave and say, never mind, I don't feel like paying you, I don't feel like doing this anymore, or if you are just to leave and leave it half built, this would be a serious problem. So that's some evidence we see for Hobbes's view. Right. The idea that authority is required for trust makes sense in this context as well, right? So if we're going to cooperate, right, if we're going to have these contracts and that sort of thing, we need somebody who can enforce them. So something has to be over and above us that can make sure we keep our words, at least most of the time. So Hobbes does seem to be onto something here. There's both a sort of intuitive sense, and we're like, yeah, I can see why I wouldn't trust people in that sort of environment. But when we look at environments like that, what we see is that people don't trust each other. They don't cooperate. So there's definitely something to be said for Hobbes's view that political authority is, at the very least, useful in pursuing the good life by forcing or allowing cooperation. However, there are people who disagree with this particular analysis, and these people are called anarchists. So let's take a look at the motivating philosophy, anarchy, and see what they have to say for themselves. So anarchy is an attempt to establish cooperation without any sort of government or political authority. No states, no governments, no cities, what have you. Anarchist views typically perceive social evils as the result of government intervention. That is, not only do we not need government, but government is actively bad. They prioritize personal freedoms as one of the most important goods we can have, that is individual freedom, and of course governments restrict those. And at the same time, they tend to prioritize those especially over social goods, things like highways. Typical challenges to anarchy involve questions of the internal and external stability. That is, what's to stop me from taking over the town, right? So let's say we're in an anarchic community, and I look around and I realize I'm the biggest, baddest dude here, and I say, well, I think I'm king now. There's nothing to stop me from doing that. Now, if we were all dedicated anarchists, of course I wouldn't do that. But it seems quite likely, given what we know about human history and human psychology, that somebody will eventually try to take over. And if they are sufficiently powerful, they will succeed in doing so. And in fact, even if I'm only slightly more powerful than other individuals, to fight back against me, they'll need to form units to cooperate. And then there's nothing to stop them, with their now more powerful unit, from conquering society. External stability, likewise, who's to stop an external invader, right? So we're living happily in our anarchist commune. Who's to stop a government from just rolling over us with their army, right? They'll have an organized military apparatus while we're sort of individuals with no external structure forcing us to cooperate. So they're going to be better at cooperating than we are. Another major challenge has to do with the development of public goods, so highways, educational systems, hospitals. It's hard to see how anarchists would do that. And now there are a couple of proposals here, but very few of them actually end up bearing out in the end. They don't really hold together very well. And it's important to think about things like, okay, well, we need highway systems. I benefit from the highway system every day of my life, even if I'm not on it, right? Even if I don't drive on it today. Because people I rely on, right? I don't know, the delivery guy, right? The delivery guy takes the highway to get to me. So the way that I receive my goods is dependent upon the highway system. Likewise, even if I'm not currently in high school, I benefit from public high school education in that it educates my peers. And they are able to function better, complete tasks more efficiently, right? Work harder, all the sort of things we should desire, right? And it's going to be hard for the anarchists to develop a system in which the public goods are provided as we need them, right? As we seem to benefit from them. Finally, it's not clear that anarchy is even sociologically plausible. It looks that when you look at a group of people, even if they don't have a rule set or a law system in place yet, you give them long enough and they'll develop one. The trend appears to be then that human nature is such that we naturally migrate towards social organization. If that is true, then the anarchist is going to be asking something from our psychology that may not be plausible. But before we just discard anarchy, let's look at two important variants of it that have some answers to these questions, though ultimately I think they will be unsatisfactory. The first kind of anarchy we're going to look at is called communitarian anarchy. And it's called communitarian because it's all about communities. Cooperation is facilitated by the fact that we live in a community together, right? We're good neighbors. And that makes sense, right? When you help your neighbor unload their car from the grocery store, it's not because you fear government repercussions, it's because you're neighbors, and that's what neighbors do. It's the neighborly thing. Communitarian anarchy, though, while plausible for very small-scale interactions, has some serious problems when you try to generalize it. These are called problems of scale. It doesn't seem to function very well in the globalist urban environment, right? It doesn't seem to function very well where people can come in and out of town quickly, right? So if they become, so they can come into town, scam everybody, and leave, right? You just jump town before anyone's able to figure out that you're a bad person and you've stolen all their stuff, right? So all the typical community factors that would prevent me from ripping people off aren't preventing me from that anymore. And actually we see a long tradition of that if we look back in the past of sort of scam artists who would go from town to town, set up shop for a few weeks, scam the entire town, then run. Likewise, it doesn't seem to handle well things like New York City. Because while New York City is ostensibly a community, right? We all live in the same area. In fact, we're very close to one another geographically. The same sort of communal forces that you see at work in, say, small towns do not appear to be at work here. In fact, New York City is one of those places where you might not know your neighbor's name. And that's kind of funny. So that's going to be one problem for it, how communitarian anarchy can deal with global systems and urban environments. Another problem is cooperating with other communities. Right? Communities often have very different views and standards, and particularly moral views, right? So it's not clear how they're going to come together and decide to cooperate. And in fact, closeness to your own community often involves, or often brings along with it, an intense distrust of people in other communities, right? That's the "you're not from around here, are you?" kind of approach to life, right? We are a close-knit community, you're an outsider. And so what we see is it actually is very hard for these communities to cooperate without some intermediary or overarching force forcing cooperation. So that's the communitarian anarchist. Let's take a look at the market anarchists now. Now, sometimes these are called mutualist anarchists, and other times they're called libertarians. The basic idea of market anarchy is that you use the market to facilitate cooperation. That is, you have some sort of system of economic transactions, and that gets us to work together. Because I need someone to protect me, so I hire a firm to protect me. And you hire them, and a couple other people hire them, and then somebody else hires another firm, and that sort of thing. Now, this provides a way for public goods to, in some sense, be provided. But there are a couple of serious problems here. One is the problem of rival firms. So I'm with market firm A and you're with market firm B. And you mess up, and you and I get into a car accident. Well, I want my firm to make you pay, and you want your firm to make me pay. Well, now those two firms have to go against one another. Now, of course, they can hire a third firm, an arbitrator, to try to help them figure things out. But there's actually no reason for either of them to agree to that necessarily. And it's not clear that they would. And in fact, if I found out that my firm was willing to compromise on the values that I expect them to deliver, so I might go to firm C, which has a no compromise policy, which means they don't go to arbitration, they just take the money from you. And then you go to firm D, which is similar. And now we just have war, essentially. Without some overarching structure to govern how these firms interact, we encounter some serious problems. Another issue is the problem of market trends. So, I go to firm C and you go to firm D. What ends up happening is either we collapse downwards into the state of war that Hobbes saw us living in, right? You have hired your soldiers and I've hired mine, and they go to war with one another, right? Or everyone says firm C is the best, so we all just pile in. The result then is, well, firm C is now the government. Right? We've just made a government. So it looks like the way that market trends would function in this sort of anarchist environment are such that it would ultimately be self-defeating. It would enforce a government or total collapse. Another issue here also is, by the way, is that much of the market as we understand it exists only because of the government. Things like credit and contract enforcements. If the government were not in place, it is not clear how we would handle those sorts of things. So we'd be at a much more limited sort of market, and we may not be able to provide all the goods that we are used to and seem to need. So these are reasons why we might reject anarchy. Right, so we've covered two major screens of anarchy, and it looks like neither of them are going to be adequate to solve our problems, the sort of social issues. Now, of course, this isn't dead, right? We're not done. Right? The anarchist does have responses here, and a full treatment of that it would be a course in itself. And so it's a lot of interesting reading. But it looks like what we're going to be needing to do is finding some system of political authority after all. So what we're going to talk about next, then, are ways that the political authority can function on us. Right. We want to know why we bother to do what we are told. Where is the origin of what we call political obligation? So the authority says, don't speed. Why do it? Why not speed? The first reason we might not speed is fear of force, right? The government is going to arrest you, right? They're going to fine you, what have you. And this is pretty straightforward, right? You don't murder because you're afraid of getting caught. However, this lacks the push of principle, and essentially says that we need an external justification to follow political authority under any circumstance. Now, this might actually be the case, and if so, what we have is a situation where you obey the law if and only if you believe that the government will force something negative to happen to you if you don't, or will give you benefits if you do. This is the kind of person who stops at a red light, looks both ways for a cop, and seeing none, guns it, right? If no force is threatened, right, if there are no cops around, obedience doesn't really matter, actually. This is undesirable for many people for a lot of ways, a lot of reasons. One is that, well, there can't be a cop on every corner. Despite the propaganda, right, the government can't always be watching you. Or if it were to be, it would be such an exhaustively large and expensive government that it would probably collapse under its own weight. So we probably want to find something a little more substantive, a little more positive than fear of force. One answer here is contract. And the idea here is that we have agreed to a sort of contract of how we're going to live together through living in a certain environment, participating in a certain society, right? So merely being in the nation is the most minimal version of this. Some versions talk about things like, well, I've received benefits for being an American, right? I've received police protection, so I've agreed to adhere to American law. Or finally, even it might just be voting, right? I've voted in an election, which means I have given my ballot saying I sign off on the American project. And this is plausible in a lot of ways, but it has some tricky things when you apply it to governance, which is, and the biggest one is that most people don't choose where they're going to be born, live, or grow up, right? You're just born in a place and then that's where you are. I was born in America. I didn't decide that. I was just born here. And because I was born here, my participation in the American system was non-voluntary, right? I was protected by the United States military the moment I was born. I've received benefits from the United States government since the moment I was born. Does that mean that I've given up my right to complaint or signed a contract? Because that's a pretty young person to be making that decision. Likewise, I might vote in an election thinking that everybody is a lunatic, and I don't really like any of them, but I really don't like that guy, so I'm going with this one instead. That also seems weird to say that now I'm signing off on the government when what I'm really choosing between are the least evil option I can find, which is still pretty evil. So we might end up wanting to find something a little more substantive than even a contract theory. What we end up with, according to the book anyway, is this idea of fairness as a motivator, and fair play as our motivation for adhering to authority. That is, I want you to follow certain rules, so I need to follow them too. Now, one thing we come across here, when we talked, I think we talked about this when we talked about Kantian deontology, right? There's this idea, right? So I can universalize these ideas. I can say, well, hey, look at that. I want you to behave in certain ways, so I should behave that way too. There are a couple of challenges here, though. One is to say that actually the best thing for me is to be a cheater while you all follow the rules, right? I want everyone else to do this, but I don't want to do it. And it's not clear why that is incoherent. The next challenge is that I need to show that everyone benefits from fair play, quote unquote fair play, right? I want certain things to have, in the way that society is structured. I might want things that just benefit me but penalize other people, right? I want philosophers to be given a tax break. That'd be great, right? And ostensibly I could say, well, that's like fair. I want everyone to be really pro-philosopher, so I'll be really pro-philosopher, right? That's fair. But you can see how it's self-serving and doesn't generalize well to everyone. This is where you get into some of the challenges relating to sort of social inequalities and social justice. Another problem is how difficult it is to define fairness. Is it fair if everyone has the same opportunities? Is it fair if everyone gets the same use? If they pay differentially based on their use? Is it fair if we all have the same outcomes? What does it mean to be fair? And so this is actually one of the most significant structuring problems we encounter in the modern world, at least in the United States, when we talk about how government should be structured, right? What do we mean by fair? What is it fair, right? Is it fair if everyone has the same chance to succeed? That is, hey, the systems don't prevent anybody from succeeding. They don't give you any benefits based on who you are. Or is it fair if everyone is guaranteed some basic minimum success, right? Some basic minimum outcome. Is it fair if I'm charged based upon my use of the highway? Or is it fair if we're all charged equally under the assumption that the highway benefits all persons? So these are questions to keep in mind as we move forward through our class, which is, what is fairness and how does this relate, if at all, to political authority? So there are a couple of major remaining questions, and these are the ones to sort of meditate over the next few days. The first is, what kind of authority should a government have and why? Right? Should it be a democracy? Should it be a monarchy? What have you? The next, the challenge we just talked about, political obedience. Why should we obey? And what do those justifications look like? And a final tricky challenge, given the answer we just gave to why obey, is when should we disobey, if ever? There's this idea of civil disobedience, typically non-violent rejections of authority, right? Protests movements are a great example of civil disobedience. And it seems like under some circumstances, civil disobedience is the right way to go, right? Sit-ins and protests in the face of racial profiling, right? Or systematic injustice in the country in which you live, well, that seems like a good moment for civil disobedience, even though you're technically disobeying political authority. So while political authority does seem to have some fundamental force to motivate our obedience to it, at the same time, there seems to be a limit to that, where our own personal morals or our own conscience, if you'd like, trumps the state. And it's going to be very important as we move forward to think about where that boundary is drawn. With that, I will see you next week.